Young men, I say to you, get up. The words land in the middle of a funeral. A wooden bier moves toward a graveyard outside the town gate, carried by men who have done this before and will do it again. Luke records what happens next as command, not request. A stranger speaks directly to a dead man, and the dead man obeys. Behind the bier walks a woman the text never names. Luke tells us only what she has lost, a husband already gone before this day, and now a son, her only son, in a small village east of Nazareth called Nain. A crowd wide enough to fill the road follows her toward a grave that will never be dug, because a man walking the other direction decided her grief was worth interrupting. He touches the bier, the men carrying it stop, and a young man who was, by every account available, unmistakably dead, sits up and begins to talk. Luke tells us exactly what the crowd did after that. Awe, praise, the story spreading fast. He tells us nothing about what the woman did. No words from her, no name. She never appears again anywhere in Scripture. She got everything back in a single sentence, and then the story moved on without her. This is the investigation of what a woman does with a miracle nobody wrote the aftermath of. If you've ever had impossible weight lifted overnight and had to figure out what to do with the rest of your life, subscribe. You may recognize more of her silence than you expect. But to understand what she lost that morning, we have to go back further than the funeral. Grief in the ancient Near East was not a private thing you carried quietly behind your eyes. It was loud, physical, and public, and by the time Luke's account picks her up, this widow has already been living inside that loudness for some time. Scripture doesn't tell us how her husband died or how long ago. It gives us a single devastating detail instead. Her son was her only son. Some scholars who study the Greek text argue the phrasing goes further than only son and implies she had no other children at all, no daughters, no extended household of her own blood to fall back on. If that reading holds, then this woman had already survived the first loss that reorganized her entire life and had rebuilt whatever she could of it around one remaining person. Her son wasn't just family. In the economic and legal structure of first-century Judea and Galilee, he was her future. This is worth sitting in, because it's easy to read widow today and picture something closer to independence. A woman on her own, managing her own affairs. That is almost never what widowhood meant in her world. Ancient Israelite and Second Temple Jewish society ran on male guardianship. A woman's access to property, protection, and provision typically ran through a husband, and after him through a son or a brother-in-law or a father, if any of them were living and willing. The law even built a mechanism for this. A surviving brother was expected to marry his brother's widow, so she wouldn't be left without an heir or a household. It's called levirate marriage, and its entire premise is that a widow without a son was a woman without a future she could plan for herself. So picture what this funeral actually was for her, physically, before Jesus ever entered the scene. In her culture, mourning had a shape. Women customarily walked ahead of or alongside the body, and their weeping was not restrained. Professional mourners and flute players were often hired for exactly this purpose, their sound designed to make grief audible to the whole town. Some who have studied this passage closely have pointed out that a poorer widow, one without her husband's income, and now without her sons, may not have had money for hired mourners at all. What she had instead, according to Luke, was a large crowd from the town. People who came not because they were paid to, but because they knew exactly what this loss meant for her, and showed up anyway. That's the physical detail worth pausing on. A large crowd doesn't gather for every funeral. It gathers when a whole community understands that watching this burial happen is also watching a woman's security get buried with her son. There's an older story sitting underneath this one that the original audience would almost certainly have recognized. Centuries earlier, the prophet Elijah stayed with a different widow in a town called Zarephath, whose own son died. And Elijah stretched himself over the boy's body and prayed until life returned to him. Later, the prophet Elisha did something strikingly similar for the son of a woman in Shunem, a town close enough to Nain that the two locations sit almost within sight of each other across the same valley. Both of those Old Testament accounts end with nearly identical language. The prophet gave the boy back to his mother. Luke, writing generations later, uses that exact phrase again for this widow. He gave him back to her. This is context, not something Luke states outright. But it's hard to imagine Luke's first readers, steeped in those older stories, missing the echo. If they knew the pattern, they knew what this widow was walking into wasn't just a stranger's kindness. It was the shape of something they'd already read about God doing before, through prophets who had to ask. This time, no one asks. That's the detail this episode keeps returning to, because it changes what getting her son back actually cost him, and, more quietly, what it may have cost her to receive something she never had time to petition for. There's a physical detail in the timing worth noticing, too. Luke places this arrival soon afterward, the day after Jesus had healed a Roman centurion servant back in Capernaum, a town roughly a day's hard walk away, much of it uphill. That means Jesus was almost certainly tired when he reached Nain's gate. Whatever compassion moved through him in the next few moments, it didn't come from a man arriving rested and prepared for a dramatic encounter. It came from someone who had just finished a long, physically demanding journey and walked straight into someone else's worst day. Before we get to the moment itself, there's one more question worth sitting with. What does a woman do, physically and emotionally, in the minutes before the worst thing that can happen to her happens, when she doesn't yet know a stranger on the road, just as tired as she is about to interrupt it? Luke places this scene the day after Jesus healed a Roman centurion servant in Capernaum without ever meeting the man face to face. A story about faith reaching across a distance. Then, Luke writes, soon afterward, Jesus travels to Nain. Capernaum sits far below sea level on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Nain sits inland and uphill, roughly a day's hard walk away, arriving most likely near evening, which happens to be a common time for burials to take place, so the dead could be laid to rest before dark. That timing detail matters because it means Jesus and this funeral procession weren't looking for each other. Two crowds moving in opposite directions collided at the gate of a small town almost by accident. His group entering as hers was leaving. Nain wasn't a large city with fortified walls. Archaeological work in the area has found no trace of formal wall structures from this period, which suggests gate likely meant something closer to the main entrance point of an open village, the natural place where a funeral procession would exit toward the burial ground outside town limits, since burial inside a settlement was avoided. Luke's Greek uses a specific physical word for what happened in Jesus the moment he saw her, splagchnisomai. It's a visceral term tied to the gut, describing a compassion that isn't polite sympathy, but something closer to being struck. The text doesn't say Jesus felt sorry for the dead son. It says he was moved by her. The son is not yet the center of this scene. The grieving mother is. What Jesus does next would have registered as strange to everyone watching, and not only because of what came after it. He speaks to her first, "Do not weep," before doing anything about her son at all. In a culture where mourning rituals existed precisely because unrestrained public weeping was the expected, honored response to death, telling a bereaved mother not to cry could easily have sounded hollow, even careless, coming from anyone else. He hadn't yet done anything to justify the words. Then he crosses toward the bier and touches it. This is easy to read past, but it shouldn't be. Contact with a corpse, or with anything carrying a corpse, rendered a person ceremonially unclean under the purity laws most Jews of that era took seriously, a status requiring a period of separation and ritual washing before someone could re-enter normal religious life. Jesus touches it anyway, in full view of a crowd that would have known exactly what that touch meant under the law. He doesn't ask permission from the family. He doesn't wait for the mother to invite him closer. He simply stops the procession with his hand and lets whatever consequence that carries fall on himself first. The bearers halt. Luke doesn't record whether they hesitated, argued, or simply obeyed the same instinct that made the whole crowd fall silent. What we do know is that a funeral in progress, already moving, already public, already witnessed by a large crowd from the town, comes to a complete stop because one uninvited man decided her grief outweighed the ritual cost to himself. This is the moment before the miracle everyone remembers. Not the resurrection itself, but the decision that preceded it. Compassion first, contact second, command, third. A stranger absorbing social and religious risk for a woman who never asked him to. She still doesn't know, in this instant, what he's about to do. As far as she can tell, a man has stopped her son's funeral to tell her not to cry. Whatever she felt standing there, confusion, irritation, a flicker of something she couldn't yet name as hope, the text doesn't say. It only tells us what happened next. It's worth noticing who was watching this unfold. Luke specifies that Jesus' own disciples and a large crowd traveled with him into Nain, arriving at the exact moment her crowd was leaving. That means this wasn't a private encounter tucked away from witnesses on either side. Two full crowds, one grieving, one following a teacher whose reputation was still forming, stood close enough to see a stranger touch a corpse-bearing bier in broad daylight. Whatever happened next would have no shortage of people able to describe it afterward, for better or worse. There's also a quieter detail in how Luke frames the moment that's easy to miss on a first reading. He doesn't record Jesus asking the widow's permission, and he doesn't record her granting it. The compassion, the touch, and the command all move in one direction, toward her, not through her consent. In a culture built around a woman's dependency on the men positioned to speak or act on her behalf, this is a strange kind of encounter, a stranger acting entirely on her behalf without asking her anything at all. In the single moment of her life when she had the least power to refuse or request it, none of this tells us what she wanted in that instant. It only tells us what happened to her while she was still absorbing what she'd already lost. To understand why this crowd reacted the way it did, it helps to understand what this woman's life would have actually looked like if the procession had reached the grave that day. Without a husband and without a son, a widow in first-century Galilee had few paths available to her, and none of them were secure. She might have returned to her father's household if he was still living and willing to take her back. Itself a kind of social demotion, undoing whatever independence marriage had given her. She might have depended on a brother-in-law under the custom of levirate obligation, if one existed and chose to honor it, which the Old Testament record shows was never guaranteed. The Book of Ruth exists partly because that obligation could be refused. Failing both of those, she was left dependent on the charity structures Israelite law provided for widows, gleaning rights in the harvest fields, portions set aside at the edges of the grain, the kind of provision that kept a person alive without ever restoring what she'd lost. The Hebrew Scriptures return again and again to a single refrain, that God defends the cause of the widow precisely because widows occupied one of the most exposed positions in that society, dependent on a community's willingness to remember them. So when Luke says a large crowd from the town walked with her, that detail is doing real work. This wasn't simple politeness. It was likely the town recognizing in real time that they were watching a woman's entire future disappear along with her son, and showing up because there was nothing else they could do for her except witness it, which is what makes Jesus' interruption so loaded with risk. Not just religious risk, but relational and social risk aimed at himself. By touching the bier, Jesus placed himself under a purity law taken seriously by observant Jews of his time, one that would have required a period of separation before he could re-enter normal religious life. He did this in front of witnesses, with no private way to explain himself later. And if the healing had failed, if he had touched a dead man's bier, spoken over him, and nothing had happened, he would have been left standing in front of an entire town as a man who had defiled himself for nothing, and worse, who had spoken over the dead as though he had authority he did not have. There was no quiet version of this. He committed to it publicly, with no built-in way to walk it back. There's also the matter of what this act implicitly claimed about him. In the historical memory of that region, the last time God's power had reversed a widow's grief this directly, it had come through Elijah and later through Elisha. Men who prayed, who stretched themselves physically over a child's body, who pleaded with God for the outcome. Jesus does none of that here. He speaks a command directly to a dead man, with no appeal upward, no visible request. Whether the watching crowd understood the full weight of that distinction in the moment or only came to recognize it afterward, Luke makes sure his readers can't miss it. The text doesn't editorialize much, but it lets the crowd's own words do the work. A great prophet has appeared among us, they say. And then, in the same breath, God has come to help his people. Not just a prophet acting on God's behalf. God arriving. That's a theologically enormous claim for a crowd to make out loud in public in a small Galilean village about a man many of them had likely never seen before that afternoon. It's also a claim carrying its own cost. Word spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country, Luke tells us, which meant scrutiny. Attention like that in first-century Judea rarely stayed neutral for long. Every miracle Jesus performed publicly added weight to a reputation that would eventually put him in direct conflict with the religious and political authorities of the region. This moment at the gate of Nain isn't isolated from that larger cost. It's one more brick in it, and underneath all of that public and theological weight sits one woman who came to that gate expecting to bury the last person she had left and now has to figure out, in front of the same crowd that just watched her lowest moment become a spectacle, what to do with a son who is impossibly breathing again. There's a version of this that has nothing to do with funerals. It's the coworker who has to keep smiling through a meeting minutes after getting devastating news at home. The parent who has to hold it together in front of the kids because there's no room right then to fall apart. Grief and relief rarely arrive in private, curated moments. Usually they arrive in the middle of a crowd that's still watching, still waiting to see how you'll react, before you've had any time to decide how you actually feel. If you've ever had something restored to you in a way so sudden and so public that you didn't get a private moment to actually feel it before everyone around you needed you to react, you already understand something about what she may have been carrying in that crowd. What do you think a person does with grief that gets interrupted before it finishes? Here is the detail that reorganizes everything about this story. And it's easy to miss because it's built entirely out of what the text doesn't say. Look again at the two Old Testament stories this account keeps echoing. When the widow of Zarephath's son died, she confronted Elijah directly, accused him even of coming into her house to bring her sin to light and kill her son. Elijah then carried the boy's body to an upper room and pleaded with God, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." When the woman of Shunem's son died on her lap, she rode to find Elisha, gripped his feet, and refused to leave without him. Both of those resurrections happened because a grieving mother sought out a prophet and in different ways demanded something from God through him. The widow of Nain does none of that. She doesn't approach Jesus. She doesn't ask for anything. She doesn't even know, as far as Luke tells us, who this man walking toward the gate is. She is simply walking behind her son's body, on her way to bury the only piece of her future she had left, when a stranger stops the procession without being asked to. This is the turn the whole episode has been building toward. The miracle at Nain is not a response to faith, request, or desperation on her part. It's the only resurrection account in the Gospels performed entirely on Jesus' own initiative, with no petition from the grieving party at all. Every other resurrection in Scripture, Jairus' daughter, Lazarus, the Old Testament precedents through Elijah and Elisha, involve someone coming to ask. Here, compassion moves first, and the asking never happens at all. That single absence changes the theological center of gravity of the entire scene. This isn't a story about a woman whose faith unlocked a miracle. Luke gives her no recorded faith statement, no plea, no negotiation. It's a story about a woman who receives the largest possible reversal of her circumstances while doing nothing but grieving in public, exactly as her culture expected her to. Whatever this miracle says about Jesus, it says nothing about her earning it. There's a smaller discovery worth adding here because it changes how we should picture the physical setting. The village Luke calls Nain is widely identified today with the modern Arab village of Nain in the Jezreel Valley, roughly 2 miles from Mount Tabor and close enough to Shunem, where Elisha's miracle happened, that the two sites sit almost within view of each other across the same stretch of land. Excavations in and around Nain have found no fortification walls from the Roman period, but they have uncovered rock-cut tombs and burial caves dating to the same era, cut into the hillside not far outside the settlement, likely very close to where this funeral procession was actually heading that day. That detail is context, not certainty, The precise burial site tied to this specific event has never been identified, but it grounds the story in a real mapped landscape rather than a symbolic one. This wasn't a parable. It was an actual road, an actual gate, and an actual hillside of graves that this specific young man never reached. Put those two discoveries together, the unpetitioned miracle and the real ground it happened on, and the shape of the story shifts. This was never really about what the widow did to deserve rescue. It was about what showed up, uninvited, in the middle of the worst morning of her life, on a road she was walking because she had run out of other roads to walk. There's one more angle worth adding because it changes how we should read the crowd's reaction, and not just the widow's. Luke tells us the people who witnessed this were filled with awe, using language that in Greek carries an edge of fear along with wonder. Not simple delight, but something closer to being confronted by power they didn't fully understand. That reaction only makes sense if the crowd, too, recognized what they were seeing wasn't a response to anyone's plea. A healing granted because someone begged hard enough is remarkable, but it fits inside a framework people already understood. Faith produces results. Persistence is rewarded. A resurrection granted to no one who asked for it doesn't fit that framework at all. It suggests a compassion operating on its own terms, unpredictable by anything the crowd could control or replicate through their own devotion. That is very likely part of why they said what they said next. Not just a great prophet has appeared, but God has visited his people. Language reserved for describing God's own initiative, not a human being's success in petitioning him. It's worth sitting with how disorienting that combination would have been to witness. Joy for the widow, almost certainly, but also the unsettling recognition that this kind of mercy couldn't be earned through the right words or the right amount of grief, which meant it also couldn't be reliably summoned again, no matter how badly the next grieving family in that crowd might need it themselves. Not everyone walking behind that bier would get the same ending. Luke's gospel never pretends otherwise, which leaves the question this episode has been circling from the beginning. What happens to a woman who receives everything back and never had to prove she deserved it, while everyone else who watched it happen goes home knowing they might not? Here is everything Scripture actually tells us happened after that morning at the gate of Nain. The young man sat up and began to speak. Jesus gave him back to his mother. The crowd was filled with awe, said God had visited his people, and the news of what happened spread through the whole region and beyond. That's it. That's the entire aftermath Luke records. We don't know her name. We don't know her son's name. We don't know if they stayed in Nain or if the sudden attention made staying there impossible. We don't know whether either of them ever crossed paths with Jesus again, whether they became part of the wider group of people who followed and supported his ministry, or whether that morning was the only time their lives ever touched his. We don't even know, eventually, when this son died, because he would have, at some point, the way every person Jesus raised in the Gospels eventually did. Lazarus died again. Jairus' daughter died again. This young man almost certainly died again too, at some later, ordinary, unrecorded point in his life. The text simply never tells us when or under what circumstances, or how his mother carried that second loss when it came, if she was still alive to carry it at all. That absence is the real silence this channel exists to sit inside. Not what happened at the gate. Luke is specific and careful about that. But what it was like to live afterward, inside a story everyone else already knew the ending to. Two things seem plausible, given what we know of village life and the way this kind of story would have traveled. One possibility is that life in its practical shape simply continued. Her son almost certainly resumed the role he'd have held before he died, working, providing, becoming her security again, exactly as the culture around them expected an only son to be. In this reading, the miracle changes her circumstances completely, and her daily life very little. She goes back to the ordinary work of surviving in a small Galilean village, except now with the son she was supposed to have buried still beside her, and a story attached to her name that never quite lets her be ordinary again. The other possibility sits closer to what the text implies about the story's reach. That news spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country is not a small detail. Word like that, moving through several towns, tends to follow the people connected to it. It's plausible that this widow and her son, or others in Nain who witnessed it, encountered Jesus' growing movement again later, whether directly or simply as people whose testimony got repeated for years by others who wanted to know what they'd seen. Of the two, the quieter reading feels more coherent with what the rest of Scripture shows about people Jesus healed. Most of them are never named again. Most of them go back to ordinary lives that Scripture simply stops narrating, because their story wasn't meant to become a career of public testimony. It was meant to be a life given back and then lived. If that's closer to what happened, then the real emotional weight of this widow's story isn't in the miracle itself. It's in what it would have taken to walk back into her house that evening, cook a meal for a son she had already begun grieving that morning, and try to fall asleep that night, carrying gratitude almost certainly, but also something harder to name, the knowledge, now permanent, of exactly how fast the thing she loved most could be taken. A miracle doesn't erase that knowledge. If anything, it hands it back sharper than before, because now she knows precisely how much there was to lose, and precisely how little warning she'd had the first time. There's a smaller, related silence worth naming honestly, because pretending it isn't there would be dishonest to the text. We don't know how this widow's community treated her afterward. It's possible the whole town of Nain simply absorbed her back into ordinary life, grateful and unremarkable. It's also possible, and this is speculation, not anything Luke records, that being the woman at the center of the most talked about event in the region's recent memory made ordinary life harder to return to. People remember exactly whose son came back. Some of them may have treated her with something closer to reverence than friendship, which is its own kind of isolation, even when it comes from admiration rather than suspicion. We simply don't know which of these it was. What we can say, without speculating past what the text and its context support, is that whatever happened next for her happened outside the frame Scripture chose to keep. That choice isn't a flaw in the account. Luke's gospel is full of these decisions, moments where the narrative camera follows the miracle and lets the person walk off screen. It happens with the man born blind in John's gospel, healed and then left to argue with religious leaders on his own. It happens with Jairus' daughter, raised and then never mentioned again by name. The Gospels consistently care more about what Jesus did than about the rest of the life the recipient went on to live. That pattern doesn't mean her life stopped mattering the moment the story did. It means the story was never really about her life in full. It was about one morning of it. That is where this story actually ends. Not at the gate, in the noise and the awe, but somewhere quieter, weeks later, in a woman learning to live inside a second chance she never had time to ask for. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from losing something. It comes from getting it back. Maybe it wasn't a son raised from a funeral bier. Maybe it was a diagnosis that turned out better than the first scan suggested. A marriage that came back from the edge of ending. A child who left and unexpectedly called. A job offer that arrived the same week the savings ran out. Something you had already started grieving, already begun rearranging your life around the absence of, and then, without warning, it was returned to you. If that's ever happened to you, you probably know the strange thing nobody talks about afterward. The relief doesn't arrive alone. It comes with a new kind of fear standing right behind it. Quieter, but permanent. Once you've watched something get taken, even briefly, you know exactly how fast it can happen again. Gratitude and vigilance start living in the same room. You hold the good thing a little tighter than you used to, because now you know precisely how little space there is between having it and not. That's not weakness, and it's not a failure of faith. It's what it costs to love something after you've already grieved it once. This is where the widow of Nain's silence stops being a distant detail about a woman from 2,000 years ago and starts sounding uncomfortably familiar. Scripture never tells us she struggled to enjoy her son afterward, but it doesn't need to. Anyone who has been handed back something they'd already begun to let go of knows that particular ache without needing a verse to name it for them. Here's what the story actually corrects, though, if you look closely at how it happens. She never earns this. She isn't praised for her faith, because none is recorded. She isn't rewarded for waiting patiently, because she wasn't waiting. She was already walking toward the grave when it happened. The entire miracle rests on nothing she did. It rests on what Jesus felt when he saw her and what he chose to do about it before she asked for anything at all. That's the reframe worth sitting with if you're carrying that same low-grade fear of losing something you were given back. The strength required to hold on to a second chance was never supposed to come from you proving you deserve to keep it. It never came from her. Whatever restored her son to her that day wasn't transactional, and whatever restored the thing you're afraid of losing again probably wasn't either. There's a line that runs through Scripture describing God as the one who defends the widow, who is close to the brokenhearted, who doesn't ask people to earn the compassion he extends toward them before he extends it. That's the same compassion that stopped a funeral procession without being asked to. It's not a promise that nothing will ever be taken again. This widow's son, like everyone raised in the Gospels, eventually died a second, ordinary death. But it is a suggestion that what was given back to her was never meant to be gripped in fear the way she may have gripped it. It was meant to be lived in the way an ordinary life is lived in, imperfectly, gratefully, without needing to hold every day like it might be the last one. If there's a small, honest next step in this, it isn't learning to stop being afraid. It's noticing when the fear shows up and letting it sit next to the gratitude instead of underneath it, without either one canceling the other out. That's a harder discipline than it sounds like. Fear tends to want the whole room. It convinces you that loosening your grip even slightly is the same as being careless, that vigilance is the price of keeping what you love. But this widow's story suggests something different about how the thing you're holding actually stays yours. It was never her grip that brought her son back in the first place. It was never going to be her grip that kept him either. Somewhere in learning to live with a restored life, she likely had to discover, the way most people eventually do, that the tightest hold in the world can't add a single day to anything, and that loosening it isn't the same as loving less. There's still one more silence in this story worth sitting in, the one no crowd witnessed and no gospel followed. What that quiet evening in her house might have actually looked like is where we're headed next. A woman walked toward a grave that morning and walked home from a miracle instead, carrying a story she never asked to be part of, and a silence Scripture never filled in for her. Maybe you're carrying something similar right now, not a resurrection, but some ordinary version of it, something you thought you'd lost for good, sitting back in your hands again, heavier than you expected relief to feel. If that's you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. What did you get back that you'd already started grieving? And what has it been like learning to hold on to it without holding on too tight? There's no verse that tells us exactly how she carried it, but maybe that's the point. Some stories aren't finished so we can look for our own ending inside the space they leave open. We'll keep investigating these silences together, the places where Scripture goes quiet and leaves something real for us to sit inside. There's another one waiting next time. Until then. God bless you.